Hello and welcome to Chasing Leviathan. I'm here today with Dr. Tracy Pearson, and we are going to talk about how does bias impact workplace investigations. Dr. Pearson, so glad to have you.
Thank you for having me. It's great to be here.
Dr. Pearson, with almost 2 decades of experience bringing and defending complex legal matters on behalf of litigants in state and federal court, Dr. Pearson excels in analyzing problems from multiple perspectives. She's an expert in investigations and post-mortem assessment of investigations in all domains, including workplaces, child welfare, or government. Her research incorporates law, organizational change theory, pedagogical theory, history, pop culture, and neuroscience, to name only some of the disciplines Dr. Pearson drew from when she wrote After a Neutral and Impartial Investigation, Implicit Bias in Internal Workplace Investigations, which sounds really like a little bit complicated. I'm sure like we'll get into those like bits and pieces, but I am really interested, and I know that our audience, at first it sounds specific. The idea of impartiality in matters of justice in terms of investigation is just, I mean, that's an old question, right? But it's also one of the biggest questions we can deal with. So thank you so much for coming on the show. Glad to have you. If you could give us just a little bit about yourself and how you got interested in this, I'm sure that people would love to hear the background on that.
Sure. My background, you did a great job of talking about my bio. I have chased what I was going to be when I grew up for a long time. I'm still chasing it. And so when, I started out wanting to be a teacher, actually, I think I started out wanting to be a Navy fighter pilot. And then I decided I didn't want to do that. And I wanted to, eventually, I was interested in the music industry. I played electric bass, and I actually went to school for about a year, in college for music merchandising, in New York, and switched to English, and relocated again, and wanted to teach. I did a little bit of high school teaching and went, I don't want to do that. And so jumped to college teaching, and I was headed down that road. And I had a professor in graduate school at Syracuse University who we had a long conversation. And long story short, sitting around in an office, coming up with ideas that didn't impact anybody, that were just ideas, didn't seem to me to be a great use of my skill set. I was a doer.
Yeah.
And so he said, you ought to try law school. So let's do an independent study. So, go find a law professor. Well, by that afternoon, I had a law professor and a book list, and I was auditing a law class, the next term. And I was like, yep, no, this is where I should be. Applied to law school on a whim, walked in, took the LSAT like the day of, I didn't study or anything, got a score, applied, got in. Went to law school, and my first day it was like, it was like nirvana. It was amazing. I was where I belonged.
Yeah.
Wanted to litigate, wanted to go into big law. 9/11 happened. Big law stopped hiring. Big law was paying people to stay home. I had a classmate who ended up getting paid $139,000 to stay home because of the fact that they had given an offer, she had accepted, and they couldn't expand because there was such a tamp down on industry. So I went and took a job at a small law firm, and then worked my way into sort of working with most of the partners' clients, and then realizing I was being paid too little, left, opened my own law firm, and started chasing things there.
Yeah.
So I got really interested in investigations. I started doing stuff for the court system and basically investigate anything you could think of. Everything from child welfare issues, parenting issues, to people stealing money from estates.
Right.
And did workplace investigations. And there came a point in my life where I needed to stop practicing law. I litigated for almost 2 decades. It's the type of thing that after you finish a trial, you throw yourself on the floor and you're like, okay, I can't do that again.
Yep.
I mean, it's just exhausting. And I think clients don't necessarily understand that.
Yeah.
You take on your client's problem, and as if it's your own, if you do it well. That's my bias.
Yeah.
And and then it just kills you. It just kills your mental, it zaps you of all mental energy. It zaps your physical strength. You're on alert for, however many days the trial is going. You're up, 24 hours sometimes. And you're constantly rethinking strategy and stuff. And it was just exhausting. And so that coupled with, I had been diagnosed with asthma, late onset asthma, and being in dirty courtrooms aggravated it. And so it was just like, okay, I'm tired of sucking on the inhaler.
Yeah.
I got to really focus here. So I really focused on investigations. Moved to California, took a job, and looked around me, thought I had, and I do, but I had the skill set that I needed. But there was really something wrong with the way investigations were being done. Really wrong, and I couldn't figure out what it was. And it was really unnerving. And so I went back to where I started and went to grad school. I had a doctorate in law. I went back to grad school, and I got a doctorate in education, specifically in organizational change and leadership. And the way this program worked is it allowed me to pick what's called a problem of practice, so a problem that you want to solve. And I picked, I was trying to pick something around workplace investigations. Initially, I started with sort of harassment and bullying because I'm fascinated by that too. I'm fascinated by why that happened.
Yeah.
Especially with adults.
Yes.
And
kids, it makes sense, right? Yeah, but
kids don't know any better. They don't have, this cacophony of life experience. And so why are they behaving this way? But adults, why do they do what they do? Why are they so nasty to each other, particularly in workplaces? But what I ended up talking about was investigations and realizing that what was happening, the things that I was seeing, were all implicit bias. And so I searched high and low, up and down, sideways. I mean, I looked everywhere. I created Google alerts. I mean, you name it, I did it. And no one had conducted a study on implicit bias in workplace investigations. And I said, I think I'll do one. So I conducted a study on implicit bias in workplace investigations, and the information that came out of it wasn't, I suppose, given what I know about it, wasn't shocking, but it was. And, we talk about in investigations, that we're neutral and impartial. Nothing could be further from the truth.
Yeah.
So that's how I ended up where I am. And ultimately, I was interested in pursuing, becoming a legal analyst on television. And I had started making strides towards doing that. The combination of all these things coming together and swirling ended up really blasting me forward into doing television and now hosting a show and stuff like that. So,
which congratulations.
Thank you.
Yes.
Thank you. It is a learning, and it's fun. It's a learning experience. Like, I know I don't know what I'm doing. And so I learn something every day.
Yes.
It's like, oh, so that's how that works.
There you go. Yeah. Now, so forgive me, and I didn't catch it on here. What's the name of the show?
Sure. It's called Deep Dive with Dr. Tracy. It's on ENSL TV. And it's a weekly show. It's an hour long. Think of it as, sort of, it's like a Rachel Maddow type show in the sense that I'm trying to sort of move the needle on the knowledge meter towards more. But what it really is me bringing forward experts to talk about things so that we put, good, solid factual information into the environment as opposed to political punditry. And it's an hour long. My last episode of the year was, I had Dr. Stephen Hassan on, who is the world's foremost expert on destructive cults and mind control. He wrote the book, The Cult of Trump. And so that I got him as a guest was like a huge get.
Yeah.
And then I also appeared, and that came after me getting a gig on being, I'm on a talk panel once a week. It is called the Power Hour Talk Panel, and we debate what's going on in the news. And, there's a bunch of us. And it's watched and people comment on it, and it's we talk about all the controversial stuff and we fight with each other, and it's great. But my show is sort of more, it's an attempt to try to educate the populace, because I don't think there's enough of that being done.
Yeah, I mean, definite moment of connection there. In a lot of ways, that's what I'm trying to do with this, right? Like, it's political punditry. I love, there's several phrases there. Moving the needle on the knowledge meter. I'm definitely stealing that. Like, so really, really like that. That's awesome. It's fascinating. I was telling my wife that we were going to do this podcast today, and her response was, "Wait, they haven't done a study on that?" Like, you know what I mean? Like, when you met, I was like, that, because I remember it shocked me, and watching from the outside, that reaction, where she was like, how has that not been done? Like, we're, 40, 50 years into, at least, like, you'd think, collating this stuff, and no, not even close. So, go ahead.
Yeah, and trial lawyers, for years, I mean, we're talking years, years and years and years, have been trying these employment cases. And what they've tried to do is bring sociologists and folks in and put them on the stand as experts to try to do a correlation. Yeah. So, over here, you see implicit bias, so therefore it follows that there was implicit bias here. Nobody has done a freaking study. Yeah. And I don't have any idea why. The closest thing I got was a law review article that first of all, I disagreed with, but it was a law review article that had no study to it. It was just sort of analyzing some stuff. It was the closest thing. And like my dissertation chair looked high and low and sideways as well. And we're just like, well, I guess you're the first. And that was daunting.
Yeah. Oh, absolutely. And that people don't realize, I think one of the things is there's this illusion of great data. And for people who have never collected data, they don't understand how empty it is and how hard it is and how dirty it is, if that makes sense. What I'm reading, I just did an interview with Dr. Lewis Gordon. He's the head of philosophy at UConn. And I was reading in his book, and he's a black man, grew up in the Bronx, and he was talking about, he went to do studies on police brutality, and the numbers were shockingly low. And he's like, this doesn't fit at all with my experience, all the stories that from everyone I know. And then when you look at all the data is based off of police convictions, which of course is like, and I'm not here to start an argument about that. And, if you're listening, what the important thing is that you can't, this will get into the impartiality of it. You can't ask the people who are in charge, who are being, like the ones that are being charged as the ones to keep track of the data for it. It's like, it's a clear conflict of interest, right? And so it's just like, and I'm sure we're going to run into those kind of moments as we talk about this. What would be the best way to talk about the study? So when you think about when you started this, what are the results that you found most interesting? What was your method as you walked through this?
Sure. Let me start out with the method. Yeah. So I came at it from that this is a knowledge problem, or rather an education problem to be solved. And so I was looking at it using Clark and Estes' gap analysis model. So what was the knowledge of and I was focusing on, for the written study that I've written, it's focused on internal, but I collected data for both internal and external investigators.
I remember you mentioning that. Yeah.
So the question was, what is the knowledge of internal investigators about implicit bias? What is the motivation for doing the work? Why are you a workplace investigator? And what organizational factors are either mitigating or aggravating implicit bias in workplace investigations? So I was looking at it as a knowledge, motivation, and organizational factor issue. All three of these components sort of working on this problem. And the method was it was a mixed method study. So I did a survey that I wrote myself that included also a psychological assessment on social desirability that was embedded within it, that had a very strong reliability and validity factor. I abandoned the IAT, which is the implicit association test, which has just all sorts of really, it's ubiquitous, and it is actually so flawed because all it does is test time reaction. And so what I went with was social desirability.
Is that,
which got,
forgive me for interrupting, is that like they put pictures on screen and you have to hit different keys?
yeah, the IAT, it comes out of, I don't know exactly who wrote it, but it's hosted on this Harvard site, and I don't want to cast aspersions on it, but there's literally two schools that fight with each other constantly.
Yes.
I thought, that are just like, this is garbage, this is great, this is garbage, this is great.
Yep.
And really what it comes down to is it can be pictures or it can be words, and
Yes.
and what happens on the screen is there's it's insects or flowers, and then what they're trying to do is they're trying to capture and they switch them around, and they switch the words around on the page, like positive, negative, bad, good, whatever the words, because there's different iterations of this thing
Yes.
out there. It's very much open code, and so the idea is what they're trying to do is and you're supposed to do it as fast as possible. You have like two fingers on a keyboard that you're trying to do this with, and what you're trying to do is capture what's sort of this overhang. It's sort of like a hangover of effect of, I see something and then I apply my thoughts and feelings about that to this next thing that's completely unrelated. And somehow that sort of captures, if that makes sense, an implicit bias that is part of your thought process. And the argument against it, and the reason why I didn't use it, because I think it's a very strong argument based on some of the data to come out in other studies, because there's studies about the study,
Of course, yeah.
is that it is testing your reaction time. And the more times you take it, the faster you get at doing it, that the implicit bias, that thing that they're trying to test, it gets less. And so really you're testing someone's reaction time and not their mental thought process.
Right.
I had thought about creating one like it.
Yeah.
But it required way too much coding that I just didn't have time for.
Yeah.
Yeah.
I have taken it.
Yeah.
And I hated it. It felt really weird. I'm not good with reflex type games anyways. My wife kills me at Dutch Blitz and games like that. So it was the most nerve-wracking experience. And I would start thinking about something else, which is just like typical of me anyways. And then I'm like, wait, did I just record something that I'm like horribly, I have this horrible implicit bias. Yeah, no, sorry. That's just, I was as you were describing it, I was like, I have taken that. Yeah.
You were having like a trigger response. Yeah. No, I've taken it. I didn't like it. I didn't like the way it worked. I thought, God, this is going to be too hard. So, and it's not going to help. It's not going to help. It's going to be attacked by the people who attack that test. I don't want to do that. I want this to be incredibly valid. So, what I did was I went with a social desirability test.
Mm-hmm.
And so embedded within that survey, without them knowing, was a series of questions where, things like, I never litter. And you're supposed to say true or false. And so there's a series of things. And what it's testing is, there's a sort of an average out there. And it's testing how likely you are to like give answers that make you look good versus, sort of truthful stuff. Like everybody's dropped a gum wrapper on the ground, right? And so it's testing that sort of stuff. Generally speaking, what it found was that workplace investigators, whether you're internal or external, that you tended to lean in the direction of wanting to be perceived as socially desirable. And that became important in the study for understanding why investigators will do what the organization who hired them wants them to do.
Right.
and they won't stand up and say, wait a minute, no, this is what the evidence says, this is what we're going to do, and if we have to fire the vice president of whatever, then that's what we're going to do. That this was the finding.
Yeah.
And so, it somewhat explains a little piece of why people who are in power get to skirt the ramifications or accountability. So that was embedded in there.
Mm-hmm.
There was questions embedded in there about things about my favorite series of questions. Actually, they worked together, and they were just declaratory statements with nothing more. So, for example, most allegations of sex-based harassment or discrimination are usually true. And you had to pick on a scale of either, definitely yes, neither yes nor no, maybe yes, something like that. It was like, this five scale gradient. And what happens is that the only right answer to this question is neither yes nor no. If you don't have a bias. Every other answer indicates that you have a bias, because when you look at the question has no facts.
Yeah.
So it's based on your opinion about most of these cases. And so you have to be aware that you have that bias,
mm-hmm.
and you have to correct for it. So really what the study was testing was most investigators have a book knowledge understanding of implicit bias, but they don't have applied knowledge. They don't understand how it comes out in their work and where it can hide. So that's one thing. The other question, and that was my favorite, was I gave them like a series, I can't remember, of maybe 12 words. They were adjectives, or feelings, they were emotions. So I feel, happy, sad, frustrated, indifferent
mm-hmm.
was a word I put in there. And they were basically all binaries, and they were mixed up. And I asked them to, without any other whatever, I said, I want you to select all of the feelings that you've ever had conducting investigations. Not one investigation, not two, not your first, not your last, all. And at any time. And their response was to pick indifferent the least amount of times. So they apparently have never felt neutral, because the dictionary definition of indifferent is neutral. And I found that just shocking and wonderfully, in some ways, revealing, given the way that the other questions were answered. One of the biggest finds that came out of the internal data, so the internal investigator data, was that there's this narrative out there that men don't believe women, like men don't believe sexual assault happens, mm-hmm. or sexual harassment happens. And what the data showed was that men believe women more than women believe women. When I started to analyze the demographics on it, that to me was huge.
Yeah.
That these male investigators were more likely to have an implicit bias that this was true.
Yeah.
And women were much harsher, which makes complete sense when you understand things like Queen Bee syndrome, which came out of the 70s. And basically, in a nutshell, women in authority are much harsher on women who are lower than them in the hierarchy. And there's been lots of studies on that.
Interesting.
So, what the study demonstrated was that workplace investigators are not neutral. They don't understand how it creeps up in their investigations. They also told me 95% of the time that their organization interferes in their investigation. So, the people who hire them to do this work are telling them what to do, when they're supposed to be independent. And so what it did was it established, and I worked really, really hard with my committee and my dissertation chair, to make sure that this was valid and reliable, in every way, because it was so important. And, that what it established was that there is a problem, and that the lawyers were right. There's a problem.
Yeah. And
so out of that came a bunch of recommendations. And, one of the recommendations was a conceptual model for training that I developed. So how you would train, we don't train people correctly, but how you would train an investigator or anyone else, frankly, to recognize implicit bias in a contextual situation, as opposed to just like, hey, this is what implicit bias is. I came up with a toolkit on how to analyze your organization and figure out where implicit bias is hiding in your organization's compliance structure. I also recommended that we needed to have policies and procedures that made sense. That's sort of the shorthand of it. But that made sense when it came to when an investigator felt that the organization was interfering in their investigation, so that they would be able to do something about it and not just move in that direction of social desirability. Because the reality is that there are people who are so dependent on the outcomes of these investigations. They're the people who have been accused. They're the people who are doing the accusing. And their lives in many cases are depending on the outcome of this.
Yeah.
And the power that you hold as an investigator is enormous. And you need to understand, when your mind is abusing it. And I also came up with a different definition of implicit bias because I didn't think it was accurate. I really wanted to understand where it came from and what it was. And so I did a lot of neuroscience research to find that out.
Okay. So tell us what would be your definition then of implicit bias, because I think that's that's obviously very important to what we're talking about. Yeah.
Yeah. Implicit bias generally is understood as the unconscious beliefs that guide our actions. And that just doesn't do it justice. What it really is a survival mechanism. It's the unconscious beliefs that act as a survival mechanism as a result of what's called pattern detection and probability determination, which is how your brain processes information. That informs how how you're going to make your decisions about essentially what to do next. That's a paraphrase about what I wrote. But ultimately, my definition incorporates neuroscience because, for I don't know how long, I guess ever since racism started, right? That we've had racism, and racism is racism. We got to fix it. It's racism. We got to fix it. Oh, okay, it's racism. We have to fix it. Okay, tell me how. Mm-hmm. Oh, well, here's the thing. Here's how your brain works, right? Your brain, your entire life has picked up data, and it's picking up data 24 hours a day, 7 days a week. Even while you're sleeping, it's picking up data. It's searching and looking for information, and it's categorizing that information into, you can use the term buckets, you can turn it the term boxes, however you want to call it. Bins, across the ocean, they'll use the term bin. But your brain is putting it into categories. It's also engaging in the fastest blackjack game that you have ever played, in that it is taking the information in, trying to figure out where to put it, and trying to decide what to do with it.
Yeah.
So when you're in a given situation and you are taking in data through all of your senses, your brain is trying to figure out what is it, where do I put it, and what do I tell the body to do with it? And so all of that collides. Mm-hmm. And that came out of a couple of studies. One in particular dealt with, and it was a basic, these studies are so basic and they're so important.
Yeah.
Came out of a study where they were looking for something else, really. But what they learned was that these people were asked to come and sit in an MRI machine. And they were shown a series of pictures, and about 12 of them. And they were asked to guess what the next picture was. Simultaneously, they're taking a snapshot of the brain. And they were trying to guess what the next picture was going to be, but they had to do it quickly. And for everyone they got right, they got a monetary incentive. So there was an interest created for doing it well and doing it accurately.
Right.
Okay. So that way the people were committed to doing it. And as they laid there and as these pictures came across, what they realized was that pattern detection and probability determination happen at the same time. And so really what it comes down to is that your brain hasn't changed since the first model that came out. The software, that's operating it, basically, it's the same version that you always had. It's taking in information. And back when we were trying to save ourselves from tigers, that made sense. We were a much simpler time. But now, with the massive quantities of information we've taken in over our lifetimes and take in on a daily basis, the brain, it makes mistakes. It's not infallible. And so I'm not saying that racism is a mistake, okay? Because there's a difference between implicit bias and direct bias. There are people who are racist that know they're racist. They won't say they are, but they are racist. They know they have a bias.
Right.
That's a direct bias. But then there are people that engage in things like microaggressions. They make statements that they don't recognize as being racist. Yeah. And that is that's an implicit bias that is somehow been created as a result of of that probability determination and pattern detection over their lifetime. So the way that you fix it is you become aware of it. And one of the things to come out of my study also was I did something novel, apparently, and where I said, I think that when you're interviewing a person in an investigation, that you should tell them, hi, I'm not infallible. I am very much fallible. And I have implicit bias. You have implicit bias. We all have implicit bias. And so if I say something to you, if I ask you a question where you feel that I am engaging in bias, I want you to stop me and tell me so that I know. Yeah. Because until you recognize it, you can't do something about it. And because it's implicit, you're not aware of it. Yeah. And so I want you to cede some power as an investigator, cede some agency or authority, and give that to the person sitting behind the desk. And that does two things. One, it helps you realize when you're being biased. And two, it gives them a feeling that you're going to be fair. Yeah. That you're going to treat them well because they have some power now. Yes. They come into the room, and I've done this. I mean, I've been, investigator for a long time. These people are scared. They're petrified. They know you have the authority, that you're making a determination. And just the amount of pressure on them. And, some folks come in angry. And for example, the example I give folks is that, look, a black man comes in, he's been accused of sexual harassment. And he comes in and he's angry. I don't treat that as evidence. Right. I treat that as an opportunity.
That's fight or flight response, right? You're going to see that most of the time, right? In stressful situations.
You're going to see that, but in particular, it's also he's carrying the weight and burden of history on his shoulders because, of all of that.
Here we go again. Right, yeah.
Exactly. And so I know that when I engage with that person, I have to say, hey, I know, that you're probably really afraid that I've prejudged you. And I want you to understand that I haven't. And let me tell you how I think I know you think I've prejudged you. That you're a black man who's sitting in front of me as a white woman who you probably think that I think you did it. I want you to understand. I understand history. I understand the stress that's on you right now. And I don't know anything. What I need you to do is tell me your side of the story. And I want to hear it. Right. Right. And literally you watch people's shoulders literally go. Yeah. It's shocking. Yeah. But not doing that, the idea of doing that, I've said to some investigators and they go, what? No. Yeah. Let them interrupt you.
People don't want to give up power, though.
Yeah. I will say that, by and large, the population of folks, and there were about 170 in the study total. Which is considerable. about 100, I'm sorry, 190. There was 117 in the internal workplace investigator group, so it was considerable. That they by and large believed that they were doing good, that they were trying to help, that they saw themselves as trying to be helpful. They didn't see themselves as management shills, that they wanted to find what the facts are. The problem is that that's a very biased statement. Is, what's a fact? The word fair makes me crazy. I hate the word fair. Every time I hear the word fair, I vomit in my mouth. I'm like, what does fair mean? What does it mean to you versus what it means to me? I can tell you in the Rittenhouse case that I'm sure that Kyle Rittenhouse thought the outcome was fair. I can tell you that the families of the folks that were killed didn't think that was a fair outcome.
Yeah.
So fair is subjective. It means nothing. Facts are also subjective at times, and how those facts are treated is very subjective. How much weight I give certain pieces of evidence is very subjective, and it's very much, there's not a science to this. There's an art. People try to create formulas. They try to create forms. They try to, they do everything in their power to try to come up with something. And the fact of the matter is it's very much an art. And you have to know sort of all the components that are going into that art project. You have to know, all the things that you're bringing to the table. And if you aren't aware of that, what you bring to the table, you're going to screw it up. You're going to get it wrong. And, when it's something really basic, like I had a case once where someone shoved another person. That's pretty straightforward. Okay. But when it comes down to something like, an investigation into what's called non-protected class stuff, where it's not based on race or sex or religion or anything like that. And, you've got a supervisor that's bullying a subordinate. And you're trying to figure out, did this actually happen? What I can tell you is that the study showed that investigators believe that people in those cases contributed to their own bullying by a majority. And so they have an implicit bias there toward management. And so in those cases, I'm trying to figure out, what did that person do, and was it targeted? And, sometimes what I would hear from folks is, well, is everybody else being treated that way? And it was the wrong question for people to ask, because of course not. If they weren't being treated that way, they didn't, they weren't experiencing it, because these types of bullying situations in the workplace are very targeted, very personal. They will pick things that look innocuous, and they will target that person in a way that makes it look to the average person like nothing. Like, I don't know why you're getting so bothered by that. One situation involved, an employee who had applied for a job. Now, the supervisor knew that, and the supervisor was harassing that person, but they had applied for a job, and then at a meeting at a later date, the supervisor said in front of everybody, when they introduced the person who ultimately did get the job, which was not the employee that was being harassed, we hire only the very best people for this job. Well, the person who was sitting there, who had applied for the job, was tearful and very much hurt by it.
Yeah.
Everybody else in the room didn't understand, like, why would that be a problem for her to say that?
Yeah.
So, it's very targeted. In fact, there's an article called Corporate Psychopaths, who they did a study trying to figure out what causes this. Why do supervisors behave the way they do? And it really, they don't have an answer for it. It goes back to power and control. When you have power and control, you abuse it. But why do you abuse it? And that's not clear. Yeah. You get into some very deep philosophical questions there about the human nature. Yeah. Yeah.
It reminds me, and C.S. Lewis talks about this in Screw Tape Letters. And I really, fortunately, I read that at a young age, and it's always helped with things like this kind of hidden harassment, right? I think everyone can understand what you're talking about, whether it's corporate or not, in terms of family, right?
Yes.
The things that, like, I mean, in the example he uses, someone can ask what's for dinner or what time is dinner, and to anyone else, like, if you just read those words on a page, it doesn't mean a thing. But at that time and place, it's basically a slap in the face, right? It just speaks volumes based on tons of history, right, that no one else is privy to, about your questioning their competence, or you're like, oh man, you know, it's like, it's tuna salad, and there's so many variations in tone that matter so much there. Even as you said, and I would love for you to give some examples when you say subjective facts. What would be a good example of that? And I mean, the one that you even said, it's a simple case, but like, most people would say, well, he shoved him, and that's a fact. But what constitutes a shove can be pretty, you know what I mean? Like, that could be of like, there's a boyfriend, girlfriend, you know, like the girlfriend, you know, shoves playfully, right? And is that like ground? Right. So, what can you give an example of a subjective fact so that you can?
Sure. I mean, you know, somebody who says something, I'm going to slap you if you keep doing that. Yeah, that's a fact. It's subjective though, because what did it mean? What did it mean by that? Did you really mean you were going to slap them, or were you just kidding around?
Yeah.
And so there's a subjective component to it where you have to keep digging for more information to figure out what that is. And in a lot of organizations, they've adopted these no tolerance policies. And they turn the world upside down in those situations. You know, I had an office mate, and I love him dearly. I really do. But at one point, he would sit behind me, and he had a clicky pen, and he click, 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 click. And that's like the bane of my existence. Like, you know, like if people wanted to harass me, they'd probably call me on the phone and just press the clicky pen over and over again. It's that little noise stuff makes me crazy. And it's just enough to just set me off. And you know, I was very mindful, because we're both investigators, to not turn around and say, if you keep doing that, I'm going to kill you. Okay. But if I had said it to him, he would have thought it was funny.
Yes.
But if somebody had heard it, I would have been charged with a violation of the policy.
Yes.
Because the policy had no tolerance for words.
Yes.
The policy, however, did have an intent mechanism or intent requirement for physical action, which made no sense to me whatsoever. It was so backwards.
That's
when you
confusing.
talk about,
Sorry.
It's so backwards. Like it made no sense. I had no idea who wrote it. I was just like, no, it's just my job to follow it. Okay. And there's certain things where you just like, you can only have so many fights over things that, like, okay, this is not what I can fight about today. But the thing about a shove, you're right. So, you know, somebody comes up behind you and out of nowhere pushes you, knocking you over. You know, to me, that's not subjective, because it's not reasonable. Reasonable, you go to that reasonable person standard, knowing all of the facts, you know, like the omniscient narrator. What happened here? The person got into an argument with someone else, they came out, and then that person was walking, and then the second person shoved them.
Yeah.
Okay, there was no rational basis for shoving somebody, you know, in a work environment. You know, if this was an elementary schoolyard, you might be playing around. Yeah. And it might be a little bit different. So it's subjective. Yeah. It's subjective based on context.
Yes.
But I do, go ahead.
I was just going to ask, could you, because I don't mind using subjective facts. Would another way to talk about it would be in terms of like facts and interpretations that are like necessary interpretations?
Yeah, I think that there's always some subjectivity in it. I think that, you know, what you call something, is it a hit? Is it a shove? Is it a punch? You know, is it a tap? You know, all of those things can in fact be the same thing. It's subjective based on the word you use, right? There was some conduct. There was something coming in contact with something else. But what was it? Yes. You know, and what did it mean? And words matter. So what word was used to describe that is subjective, yet we treat that as a fact, right? So Mike shoved Steve. Mike tapped Steve. Mike punched Steve. All of those are the same physical action.
Yeah.
Okay. But you know, what that word is has connotation to it. And so, yes, it's interpretation, but it's also subjective in the sense that you know, it's a synonym. These are all synonyms for the same thing, right?
Yes.
You know, and then you have to look at the greater context of how did it happen?
Right.
You know, they were sitting at lunch, and when somebody said something to someone else, he tapped him.
Yep.
He slapped him.
Yep.
He punched him in the shoulder. All of those things might be completely acceptable in that relationship. Because they know each other really well and work together for a long time, and that's something that goes on all the time. You know, they're always punching each other in the shoulder. And yet, you know, if you were to take it out of context, that would be a violation of a policy potentially.
Yeah.
Depending on how the policy is written.
Right.
And policies are written badly.
Yes. Policies are written, and I'm going to go out on a limb here, and I'm curious to hear your response to this. Would you say policies are generally written more to protect the company than to actually enforce right standards?
It depends on where you are and what type of company.
Yeah.
No, really, it depends on what type of company you work for. You know, like in companies where the policy is written by a group of people, so where it's written by like a committee, like let's say at a university or college, where you have like a mixture of people. Typically, that's sort of how a camel happens. Like you get a group of people that don't have any knowledge about how to write a policy. You know, there's a history professor, there's a philosophy professor, there's an art history professor, there's, you know, somebody who works, you know, in janitorial. There's all these people come together to write a policy, and they don't know how to do it. And then it comes to me, and I have to interpret it. And I'm like, where are the elements? How do I figure this out? And how do I enforce this? This sounds really aspirational, as opposed to, you know, people who actually know how to write policies. So, you know, folks who have at least some training in how to do that, understand that you're looking for some sort of objective test, some objective elements in there.
Yeah.
And you know, the example I gave you of things being backwards, that came from a university. I was just like, this makes no sense whatsoever. Like, I don't know how. Okay, fine. I got to find intent when somebody hits someone, but when someone says words, no intent. All right. I don't know how I'm going to deal with this.
Yeah.
And people, what happens is then these units that are doing these investigations, they come up with ways around it. So they create these sort of internal rules about, well, we're going to look at the context of the words.
Yes.
Even though the policy didn't say that. Yes. It doesn't say you can't do that.
Yeah.
So we're going to look at the context of the words to read in intent, so that way we can get around the what is an absurd outcome.
Right.
But that then applies here, but it doesn't apply in that situation. And, you know, and that's where the social desirability factor comes in, because, you know, hey, look, over here, this person's really valuable.
Yeah.
So we don't want to make a finding against them.
Yes.
And there, you know, sometimes it'll be overt. Organizations will be really overt about it. Sometimes organizations will be less overt about it. They will do it in sort of subtle ways. They will, you know, they'll make comments, you know, that will either be supportive of that, let's say, you know, oh, yeah, I think it's going to be a finding, and they'll go, good. All right, next. And then move on to the next one. And as opposed to sometimes what they'll say is, we can't make a finding against George. We can't. Got to win the football game. Can't make a finding against George. And so you can't do that. And there's incredible pressure placed on these investigators, to the point where in some of my interviews, where people talked about circumstances where they had to go above head, to say, we are going to make the finding, whether you want us to or not. And then you can decide how you want to deal with it.
Yeah.
And there's a subjectivity in how, is it even going to be investigated?
Right.
Is there any, you know, yeah, that doesn't sound like it. No, let's toss that back. No, we're not going to move forward with that. Or people will sit down and meet with the complainant, and they'll say, are you sure you really want to move forward with this?
Yeah.
And that type of behavior is again, it's social desirability. Do you stand up and want to enforce your rights, or do you lean in the direction of not wanting to look like you're a problem? And that comes down to something I'm very passionate about, which is I think organizations should herald and respect and value the employee that speaks up. Stop calling them the problem. They are telling you there's a problem in your organization. So go fix it. They could sit silently and just let this thing hit you in the face at some point if you want, but they're willing to stand up. And organizations don't do that. What they do is they create these cultures and environments where people are afraid to speak and they're afraid to talk. And then, the legal profession has done a tremendous job on this one, which is that employees that have brought lawsuits, what they'll do is they will require the employee to resign as a condition of settling the lawsuit. And so then that person's out of a job. They've got a settlement, but they're out of a job. And so we get that person out of here. Instead of treating them like, hey, there's this great movie called Catch Me If You Can.
Yes.
And it's one of my favorites for a lot of reasons. But at the end of the movie, so for your listeners, they don't know it, it's this guy who basically is a fraudster, and he's able to transform himself into anything. He can be an airline pilot, he can be a doctor, anything, you name it, a banker, you name it. And
based on a true story.
It's based on a very true story, yes. And what happens is the FBI agent chases this guy and chases this guy and chases this guy. Finally catches him, and they put him in jail, and he's sitting there, and he's like, he realizes at some point he's like, maybe this guy could help us out with this with the counterfeit stuff, because he was counterfeiting everything. You got to counterfeit everything. So they bring him into the office and they said, can you tell us if this is counterfeit or not? And he's like, let me look at it. Oh, yeah. No, this is totally counterfeit. Let me tell you how they did it. And so what they did was they realized this guy could actually be an asset because he was just so good at doing it.
Yes.
And he had evaded for so long that they brought him in and said, you're an asset. Why wouldn't in an organization, when an employee says, there's a problem over here and I'm telling you about it, okay, and I'm willing to stand up and say something to you, why does the organization want to get rid of that person instead of saying, wait a minute, there's some value to this person. They could probably help us fix this.
So, yeah, I mean, yeah. The interesting thing, and I have found this to be true, it kind of goes hand in hand, and feel free to disagree. I feel like it goes hand in hand with people who are more concerned about the 8 to 5 and the lack of purpose in their job. And so it's much easier to sweep real problems under the rug and then allow it to be someone else's problem after they retire, or if they can hopefully just let it go away, than actually maintain excellence in their organization. Do you feel like there's a connection there?
I think that what happens in organizations, and this is sort of a fascinating conversation, in that organizations, they recruit for diversity, right? And they recruit for not just diversity in person, but in thought. But then once you join their organization, you're expected to shed that diversity and melt down into this melting pot and become part of their culture and adopt their views and adopt their belief structures and accept what they accept. And that's the first mistake. If you're recruiting for diversity, it's because you want diverse thought and experience. And so, it's when you step up and say something that's against the family. It's sort of like the mob. You spoke out against the family, and so we have to get rid of you. But I think that what happens in these organizations is it's an us versus them mentality. Right. So everybody has adopted this sort of cyborg mentality, and when somebody wakes up and goes, "Wait a minute, hold on a second, I'm part of the Matrix." I'm mixing my television shows and movies.
Quite a bit, but
my Star Trek and my Matrix. But it makes sense.
Yeah.
It makes sense. They wake up and they go, wait a minute, I'm part of this. What, oh, hold on, I took the wrong pill. Hold on. And so the rest of the organization says, what are you talking about? No, we aren't doing that. And they tamp it down. And so even the slightest bit of it, and that then sends a message to other people who may in fact be waking up. They see it and they don't want to have that experience, so they shut up.
Yes.
And they don't say anything. The other problem is that at the very top of the organization, I have no doubt that there are people who have good intentions. And I say this just generally, okay? They have good intentions. They have these ideas. They're idea makers, right? That's their job. They're visionaries. And then they give that information to other people to sort of design and carry that out. And then it gets delegated to other people and it gets delegated to other people. It's like the game of telephone. They're leaving out details. There's implicit bias. There's agendas. There's all sorts of things. There's direct bias that happens. And so what happens is by the time that this message at the very top gets down to the people at the bottom, it's so diluted and so massacred that it ends up being just wrong. And that's what we end up with. And then there are hierarchies and there are, fiefdoms and, certain people don't want to be told what to do by other people. And, there's this stuff that goes on and it's really a cultural problem. And then I see organizations saying, well, we need to fix our culture. Yep, you do, but you actually can't do it by going about fixing your culture. Your culture is sort of the result of things that are going on. And you have to fix the things that are going on if you want to have a better result.
You mean you can't just get like a ping pong table and it just makes everything better? No. Okay.
No, and you can't create glossy marketing materials that say that you're fixing your culture. You can't just say you're fixing your culture. You have to actually try to figure out why this is happening, like truthfully why this is happening. Yes. And then what you have to do is fix those individual things. It's one of the reasons why I liked Clark and Estes' gap analysis so much is that you can literally use it on everything. Like for your listeners, like literally you can use it for everything. So the issue is knowledge, motivation, and organizational factors. So when my husband, doesn't do what I want him to do, I'm trying to figure out, does he not know what it is that I want him to do? Does he not know how it is? Is he not motivated to do it? Is there something impeding him there? Is there some sort of self-efficacy issue there? Is there an organizational factor? Do we not have the tools and the things needed to do the thing that I asked you to do? Literally, he practiced law for a while too. So you have two lawyers and then somebody who has this doctorate in organizational change. And so I bring these tools to bear into arguments about, well, why didn't you take the Christmas tree down? Did you not know that I wanted to? I know you know how to do it. You've done it in the past. And literally, we discovered that the organizational factor was that the handle broke off of the where the garage is. We live in and everybody in LA lives, unless you're really rich, lives in a rental. And so somebody broke the handle off the garage that is shared with another unit, and so he couldn't get in. So there was an organizational factor impeding his ability to do what he needed to do Sunday.
Yes.
And I was like, okay, well, have you done anything to fix that?
Yeah. Yes. Yeah. It's so funny because I live in a multi-generational house with my parents and my wife and my two kids. And all the adults at one point were part of a student life department and received counseling training. And so family meetings, we don't ever say, how does that make you feel? But it's all variation until I can tell my dad's just getting impatient and he's just like, okay, like how can we actually fix this? But, oh man, I
do that. Good. We debate. We'll argue with each other and it'll be cross-examination. Yes. Yeah. So let me see if I understand you correctly. Did you, and we'll, it'll become, sort of this double cross-examination. It's hilarious.
Oh man.
Yeah.
That's so funny. We are coming close to time. I want to be respectful of your time. So as we wrap up here, if you don't mind, one question that really stuck out to me, and I think will be really helpful for our listeners, kind of a dual question, a follow-up application question. Where does implicit bias hide? Where are the kind of clear places where it hides? And what are the best ways to handle that, both as the person who is being biased against and as the person who has that bias?
Sure. In an investigation context?
If you can make it
generally.
if you can make it general, that's great. If you want to use examples from workplace, I'm sure lots of people can use that information.
Okay. Well, I will tell you that it hides in your feelings about doing something. So, for example, in the study, I asked how likely you were to sort of like or how comfortable you were with doing certain types of investigations. And so, and I sort of laid those out into categories. So if there's something that you have to do or there's a task that you have to do and you're not doing it, you may have an implicit bias against doing it for some reason. And that may be what's driving your procrastination. Or it may be driving how you feel about the thing that you're doing. So if in an investigation context, if you are, if you don't like doing sexual harassment cases, you are automatically turned off by the idea of doing them. You're probably going to be biased against the outcome of it being true. So you're going to be biased against what the person who is reporting is telling you because you don't want to do it anyway. And so that applies across the board with anything that you do, with any task that you have to do. How you feel about the task is important, and people are not mindful. Mindfulness is a great big thing right now, and it's an important thing to understand because how you feel in a given moment really does impact an outcome.
So being self-aware about both when you're procrastinating is important, but also when you find yourself not following through on details, right? Like yes. you just like gloss over stuff because you just want to get it over with.
Yes.
Yeah. I could definitely see.
That's there's a reason why you don't want to do it. Why don't you want to do it? I don't want to do it. Why don't you want to do it? What's your feeling about it?
Yeah.
And you really got to figure out what that is. For a lot of folks, some people, it's a feeling of failure. I feel like I'm going to fail at doing it, so why would I start it in the first place? I don't want to get to do it. I don't want to do it at all. I don't even start it. I don't want to think about it, and so it gets pushed aside. I don't want to discover what I'm going to discover when I look there. I got to go through the closet, and I got to clean out the closet. I don't want to see what's there. I don't know what I tossed in there. And I'm probably going to find stuff that I don't want to see, and I don't want to deal with. I mean, it can literally apply to anything.
Yeah.
But it's implicit bias that's at play, and it is, it's a feeling that is driving your actions based on neuroscience.
Yes.
And so it comes down to just the most basic stuff.
Yes. So for instance, if you find yourself procrastinating on something, if you find yourself glossing over and wanting to finish things without doing it correctly, would an appropriate response be like to do a history check in your own story to find if there's a connection with a past event?
Yeah, I think that it makes sense to, the first thing is to just stop and figure out, don't continue doing it. Stop, recognize there's a problem, identify that you have an issue, take a break from it, and sit and think about, why. The question why is great. It's so why am I doing this? Okay, well, why that? And why that? And why that? And continue to move backward with the word why. Simon Sinek has this, what's your why?
Yes.
If you don't know your why, you better know your why.
Yes.
Okay. And so if your listeners haven't heard of him or read any of his stuff, they should. He's got some really accessible stuff on YouTube. Some of the most powerful talks I've ever seen. But you need to know your why, and so that's a good way to think about those issues. So if you're glossing stuff over and you're realizing you're missing details, or you suspect, you feel yourself doing that, you feel yourself rushing or something, then stop. Why am I doing this? Am I hungry?
Yes.
Am I tired?
Yeah.
Am I literally? I mean, it sounds silly and basic, but at the same time, is why am I doing this? And do I? Okay, I don't like the person I'm writing it for. I don't like the fact that I have to write in the first place. Why don't I like the fact that I have to do it in the first place? Really work yourself back so that you can understand the whys. And once you figure out the whys, then you can figure out what to do about that. Sometimes it's a frame shift. Sometimes it's changing the way you think about it, which is that, you know, if I do this, then what are the positive things that can stem from it? I think that we are generally, I make a guess, I haven't done a study on this, but I make a guess that we are generally gap analysis thinkers. We are people who think in the negative. We don't think about positive. And, you know, I'm not a positive all the time person. I'm very much a gap person. I always think about what the problem is because I'm a problem solver. But my husband is not a problem solver. He is very much a you know, everything will work out sort of thing. So it works nicely that way. So when I go down the railroad tracks, he says, "I don't come back up here."
Yeah.
Everything's not going to be bad. And so, but thinking about, you know, what are some positive benefits that can stem from me doing this? Well, if I clean out the closet, hey, I can go shopping.
Yeah.
Or, you know, hey, you know, if I clean out the closet, that won't be hanging over my head. And I can get something else done, and I can actually really enjoy watching the football game because it won't be hanging over my head. You know, maybe I can turn it into a fun activity with my kids or with my spouse or with my, you know, my neighbor or whatever. You know, maybe I can donate some things to charities that might need them. You know, you start to try to reframe why you're doing something, and then it changes your willingness to do it. And, you know, but again, it comes down to awareness. So you have to be aware that that's what you're doing. Like, you know,
Yes.
You're rushing through something or you're glossing it over or you're avoiding it. Excuses are my favorite. You know, what are the excuses that you put in place that for why you're not doing something?
Right.
People can justify anything.
Oh, they can. Yeah. I mean, as a parent to a 4 and 6 year old, it's much more apparent and easy, right, to look at that and be like, oh, that excuse is silly. But then when you're around it enough and then you hang out with adults and you're like, oh, it doesn't go away.
And there's truth to it.
Yeah.
Like, there's just truth to it. You know, the reason why they want to do something, you know, I mean, I love, you know, little kids in the bathtub. Like, I don't want to take a bath. Why don't you want to take a bath? I don't want to take a bath. Why don't you want to take a bath? I don't want to take a bath. Okay. What are you afraid of? You know,
Yeah.
Oh, the water going down the drain. They think they're going to go down the drain. You know, really little kids get really afraid.
Yeah.
They don't want that. And say, okay, well, see how big you are.
Yes.
See how big that is. That's not going to happen. You know,
Yeah.
and sometimes it takes, you know, some education
Yeah.
to change the way someone's thinking.
Yeah.
Sometimes, you know, it takes perspective taking. Like, what, you know, what's the perspective and trying to reshape that. But in taking that basic example in the adult context, I think that in workplaces, in relationships, in social situations, people fail to recognize the perspective of others. And I've seen that a lot lately. I mean, I you know, look, if you don't want to get the vaccine, stay home is sort of my personal belief. But you know, I need you to take the vaccine because I don't want to get sick. Or at least I want to get seriously sick.
Yeah.
I respect your perspective, but if your perspective is based on the fact that you think that you have a computer chip that's going to be injected into you, we need to have you take a look at what a syringe looks like and understand that syringe is incapable of doing that.
Right.
You know, I mean, like, there's just stuff that makes no sense.
Right.
But yet I respect your perspective.
Yeah.
But let me tell you how that perspective needs to shift.
Right.
And here's some ways of doing it.
Yeah.
You know, I just think that we need to, you know, I'm not a big, you know, hey, we aren't divided. We shouldn't be divided sort of thing. We've always been divided.
Yeah. Yeah.
It's part of our history. It's why, you know, we were divided against the king. That's why we overthrew him. At least on this continent.
Yeah.
It is a matter of understanding a perspective and at least just appreciating it for what it is. You can disagree with it, but at least listen to it.
Yeah.
And then try to work with people to change that perspective. You know, because I think that one of the things we don't do is we don't talk enough.
And when we do talk, we shout. Sorry, go ahead.
No, we shout and
Yeah.
we call each other names.
Yeah.
I saw something recently, and this is sort of, I know we're getting to the end here, but this one drove me crazy. I saw a video on we were talking before the show about reels and how like you can become like, you know, sort of paralyzed by watching these things.
Absolutely.
You just watch them for hours. But there was someone who was screaming so clearly an anti-mask, anti-vaxxer who was screaming on the street in New York at people saying that if you're wearing a mask, you're either ugly or you're into sex trafficking. And I was like, okay, I'll be ugly. I'm happy to be ugly. It's fine if I'm ugly. And I, this is very political, but if, the GOP, I think, wants me to be a sex slave anyway. So if you think that that's what I am by wearing a mask, I'm good, but at least I'm living. I'm going to live. Okay. But I mean, people screaming at each other like this.
Right.
It's just insane. And just like, what? Do you not have a job to go to?
Yeah.
Like, why are you, like, you got time for this?
Yeah.
It's just, we've become a country of insulting people has become okay.
Yeah. Yeah, absolutely. And I think there needs to be that common respect for human dignity. It's just so important for these discussions that, like, the other person is still a human being no matter what they believe, right? And that's so important. So I love ending on that note, and I love even as we talk about implicit bias, like the importance of relying on empathy and looking at the other person's perspective is so important, and just that self-awareness that we do make mistakes. So thank you so much for coming on. I really appreciate it. It's been a real joy.
Thank you very much for having me. It was fun being here.